Thank you very much, Madam Presiding Officer. Thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this very important motion. The motion requires that this House be resolved to urge all Tobagonians to reject and eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. Let me say from the onset, we agree with that resolution. Secondarily, it resolves that this House forms a committee of key stakeholders led by the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development to leverage the division's strategy for eliminating all forms of gender-based violence, as well as support the commitment statement made at the Nairobi conference in November 2019. And with regards to that secondary resolution, we agree with some reservations. And I start there by saying we agree with some reservations because if we look through what has happened in this House over the past 3 years, we have resolved for quite a lot to set up committees, to investigate quite a lot, and to do quite a lot. And we seldom get a sense of what happens after the resolution is passed. And if we are saying today, Madam Presiding Officer, that this is an extremely important issue, and we agree it is extremely important, then this motion cannot just go to a committee to die in natural death. It has to be a situation, this has to be a case, where if a committee is set up as the motion proposes, that we will not just investigate where we are in terms of violence against women and girls, but we will have actionable recommendations, and we will find a way to bring back to this House the report of that committee and to actually action these things. And I'm not saying that this will automatically be the case in this regard. However, given that we have set up several committees previously for several other reasons, and in most of the cases we have not heard, well, at least the public has not heard, what is the next step? What are the recommendations of these committees? One can't help but question if this matter will die a natural death as others. But we hope not. And so with that small reservation, we do support this motion. The truth is, Trinidad and Tobago can be perceived and is perceived by many as a violent nation. And if we are honest with ourselves, if we look at the statistics on crime in general, it is fair to say that we are a violent bunch of people. But being a citizen of this country and living here, it doesn't feel as if we are a violent people. But then again, I live in the countryside on the small of two islands, the less violent of two islands. And so it's easy to feel as if we are not as violent as the statistics show. But it is easy for the world to view us as a violent bunch of people, which is sad because we are also seen as the happiest bunch of people. And I don't know if happiness and violence goes in the same category. But when we look specifically at gender-based violence, and we look at the reports annually from the TTPS, from the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, we will see that quite a number of our women folk, and young women at that, are unjustifiably murdered. And that is a cause for concern for anyone, and should be a cause for concern for all of us. If we look at that 2017 report as referenced by the Secretary of Health, it shows that 1 in 3 women in Trinidad and Tobago experiences some form of intimate partner violence, and in particular domestic violence. 1 in 3. That is extremely high for a country our size and for a population our size. it means that nearly 130,000 of our women, let's put it into numbers, nearly 130,000 of our women experience some sort of violence. That is a lot. That is a staggering figure. But it also speaks to a broader Caribbean culture, unfortunately. Because it's not just a Tobago or a Trinidad issue, or a Barbados or a Jamaican issue. But when we look around the Caribbean region, it is quite possible that the Caribbean region ranks among the top regions for violence against women. And that is unfortunate. Because again, violence, for some reason, cannot and should not be associated with warm waters and white sandy beaches and coconut palms and sea breezes. I mean, people who live in this kind of environment should rightfully be the most peaceful on the planet. So it means that something is accounting for that anomaly. Something is accounting for a blotch in our character as a region. And so it has to be addressed. It needs to be addressed not just by us in the Tobago House of Assembly, but it also needs to be addressed nationally and regionally. It's something that CARICOM has to take up and treat with in a much more judicious manner. But what is it in our culture that gives us this propensity to be violent towards our women and girls? And I tell you, a large part of it is cultural. A large part of it is how we have been trained and how we have been raised. A large part of it is related to even our religious beliefs. And yes, I am one of those who you will consider to be very fervent and going to church every weekend and so on and active in church. But the reality is our religious upbringing, and might I dare say, in some parts of our Christian religious upbringing, and we can include the other major faiths in the country, Islam and Hinduism, have in many ways taught us to be violent towards women and girls. And if it did not teach us to do that, it also taught us to be silent where violence against women and girls are concerned. Our warped view of what manhood and womanhood, what those are, of what love and family means, and those are reinforced in our sermons. This sense of women and girls not being equal to men and boys. And yes, we have known for a long time that this is a man's world, and unfortunately so. But we have to do more to make this world and our world a more equitable place for women and for girls. And that must be said. And it must be said more frequently by male leaders in our society. Those of us who are men and consider ourselves to be men. And I don't want to go down that whole gender notion because people have a myriad of definitions for what that is. I am still in the category of things being either black or white, male or female. But those of us who consider ourselves to be men and are leaders in our society, not just at the political level, but also in the civil society, at our church, in our churches and in our youth groups and sport groups and teachers in the classroom, we have to make a much more bold effort in speaking firmly against gender-based violence, and in particular against violence with regards to our women and our girls. We have to change our interactions with our women and our girls. And I understand that some things are traditional and some things have been that way for as long as we have known it, for as long as we have known ourselves as boys and men in this society. We have been making catcalls to women across the streets, hurling sexual requests at them publicly. We have tried our very best to bully our women and girls into providing sexual favors. And I'm talking in the third person because this is a societal problem. It's not a problem that is unique to one particular group of our society. It's not unique to men and boys of African descent, or men and boys of East Indian descent, or men and boys who are Christian, or men and boys who are Islamic or Hindus. It is a problem across the society. And so all of us must take some responsibility. And not just men, but even women in our society. And even as we are preparing to set up this committee, we have to look at the role that women and mothers play in perpetuating violence against women and girls. Because I've often said, many of our toxic men in our society were raised by women, not even men. And they learned the toxicity from their mothers, not even men. So that too must be factored in the equation as we discuss and as we debate what to do. When we look at who is at risk, the United Nations tells us that around the world, women and girls who are from low socioeconomic status tend to be at a higher risk of violence than women of higher status within the society. And that's obvious. It's obvious because the women of higher status within the society tend to be the women who had access to some form of formal education beyond secondary schooling. They tend to be the women who are employed and can make their own money. And if push comes to shove, they can start their own cars and drive off and leave their wicked husbands behind. But women who are from low economic or socioeconomic standing within the society, who are not as privileged, to lead financially independent lives, they have an even more difficult time than other women within the society. And that's just one of the factors that we have to grapple with as we look at not just rejecting violence against women and girls, but also looking at what should we do about it. How do we fix it? And so there is some correlation to socioeconomic status. Across the world, we also see that immigrants are at high risk. And that is something that we need to pause a while on. With the recent upheavals in Venezuela, we have seen an influx of immigrants. And it is no secret in this house, it is no secret on the streets, it is no secret anywhere in this country that immigrants, and in particular for us, our immigrants from Venezuela, have found themselves, or female immigrants from Venezuela have found themselves at a greater risk for violence being perpetrated against them. This motion speaks to human trafficking. It speaks to sexual assault. It speaks to physical violence. And our immigrant women are at risk too. And one way in which we can judge a society is not just by how it treats its citizens, but how it treats immigrants and how we treat those who unfortunately had to uproot their lives and come to this place to seek a better life. And instead of finding a better life, they have found themselves in a position where their passports and travel documents are taken away. They are held up at some brothel somewhere, at some secret sex house somewhere. Men are paying for them to come to their bachelor parties. Men are going into bars, and they're there in bars with all their breasts exposed and all private parts exposed. Let's not pretend that it's not happening. It is happening in Trinidad and Tobago. When we pick up the newspaper, we see raids happening from TTPS, and the police service is leading these women in a straight line out of these bars and brothels where they were being abused and so on. And we seemingly are turning a blind eye to it. We are normalizing it, unfortunately, because these women are not Trinidad and Tobago nationals. And that too must be placed on the table when we are having this discussion about treating with violence against women and girls. With regards to human trafficking, the U.S. Department of State has given Trinidad and Tobago a Tier 2 ranking. And I'll tell you why they have given us a Tier 2 ranking. And I'm quoting verbatim from their report. They are reporting that the government of Trinidad and Tobago does not fully meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. However, it is making significant efforts to do so. The government demonstrated increasing efforts compared to the previous reporting period. Therefore, Trinidad and Tobago remain on Tier 2. The government demonstrated increasing efforts by expanding authorities to collect intelligence on trafficking crimes and creating new task force on intelligence gathering and prosecution to increase law enforcement's ability to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases. It also doubled the budget for its anti-trafficking unit, increased anti-trafficking training for its officials, and initiated prosecution of a complicit official. All of us know that there are many complicit officials. And many of us know that there are many immigration and police officers who aid some of these same bars and brothels and so on with getting their raw material, for want of a better term. However, the government did not meet the minimum standards in several key areas. The government experienced continued delays in prosecution and had yet to secure a conviction under its anti-trafficking law. The government decreased the amount of funding for victim services. The government did not have policies or laws regulating foreign labor recruiters. So in other words, the U.S. Department of State is saying, we see some efforts. You have generally pumped more money into national security. In other words, we have placed more on the input side. But putting resources in the input, that does not equate to solving the problem. What we are interested in is the output. What are the results? And if we have human trafficking or anti-trafficking laws, but we can't prosecute people successfully on it, if it is, we could only prosecute one complicit official when we know that there are many other complicit ones, if it is that we have reduced the amount spent on victim services, meaning the amount of money we're putting towards treating those who are victims, then it means that we are not doing as well as we ought to be doing. And there are areas for improvement in that regard. And so this issue is a very broad issue. It's a very broad issue. It requires not just the setting up of a committee, but I'm hoping that when this committee is set up, the committee will firstly identify that there is a need to re-educate our society, both men and women, re-educate our girls, or educate our girls to be much more independent. And I taught in the classroom for 7 years, and I've always said to young girls, look, you are already disadvantaged. The world not in your favor. So you might as well study a book and try to make it out on your own. Don't sell yourself short. But the reality is that many of our girls are not getting that message. Many of our girls are being taught that they ought to be subservient to their male counterparts. Because we still live in a society where it's okay to let go with cock and tie up with hen. So we tie up with hen with all kind of lasso, and they're unable to roam, they're unable to be independent, they're unable to feed as they desire, while our cocks can go roaming from neighbor yard to neighbor yard to neighbor yard. And in saying it, I'm realizing how it sounds. But it's important to understand that even in that colloquial saying is entrenched how we view girls versus boys, how we view men versus women, and the privileges we grant our men folk and our boys versus the privileges we take back and withhold from our women folk and girls. And that has to be addressed at the education level. It has to be addressed in the schools. It has to be addressed in how we teach and train our girls. And that's not just in the schools, but that also includes our churches and other social institutions, our youth clubs, our sports clubs. They too have a role to play. Our pastors and priests must preach a different sermon. And yes, the Bible requires that men be the head of their household. And most times that is preached without the responsibilities that go along with that. And that is preached from a place where you are in charge, as opposed to being preached from a place where you are supposed to take care of the women folk that you have in your household. Remember, and that must be...
You have 10 minutes more speaking time.
Sure. That too must be changed. How we sermonize gender roles in the society must be updated. We must also look at increasing efforts to investigate, to prosecute, and to convict traffickers. We have to do more, and commendations must go to the TTPS, who in January of this year opened a rapid response unit for domestic violence. Hopefully, that will result in retraining and retooling of our police officers who can treat, so that they can treat effectively with intimate partner violence. We must prosecute complicit officials and staff. We must go behind them. We must increase proactive victim identification and screening among migrant populations. We must provide adequate funding for robust victim services. We have to have robust victim services. Do we have sufficient shelter spaces? Do we have space that can allow for a woman to move with her teenage children from an abusive home? Do we have spaces that can allow for a woman to move with boys, her boy children, to a safe space? Because sometimes they can move but move alone, and it may not be safe to leave the children behind. Or because of her emotional attachment to the children, she refuses to leave them behind. We need to increase training on trafficking for shelter staff, increase funding and services for language interpreters. That too has to be part of the equation, because we now have women and girls who are not proficient at speaking English and who must be protected once they are within our shores. We must increase the ability to accept victim video testimony in court proceedings. For God's sake, we are in 2020. Why is it that we require that our victim have to show up in court and have to in person testify? That should not be the case. The laws can change. I remember when the issue between Chris Brown and Rihanna came up. One thing that amazed me was that after making the report, Rihanna wanted to pull herself back out of the case. But that did not stop the state from prosecuting Chris Brown. You know why? Because it's considered a crime against the state. And so once there is evidence, the state does not need the victim to be there to prosecute the abuser. And that is where we should be heading. And so sometimes when I hear politicians say, well, choose better partners, look at who you get married to. Yes, that advice is all good. But the reality is there is more that we can do from the perspective of the state. And that includes updating our laws so that victims don't have to go through that emotional trauma of having to go to court if there's sufficient evidence. And many times we ignore the psychological impact the abuse is having or the violent activity is having on the woman or the girl. And we wonder sometimes, why do they go back to their abusers? Why do they not follow through with the court case? The truth is many of our women and girls are not emotionally stable and independent and strong enough to go through with the court case. And so if we don't have laws that ensure that the case is followed through with, the minute a woman feels like she can't fight up with it, And they know how our court system stop already. You will be going court over and over for donkey years for this one issue. So the minute the woman feels like she can't continue with it, the case gets dropped. And that is a big, big issue. And that's why many of the perpetrators of violence against women and girls, that's why they get off unscathed. And we need to also consider adding NGO representation to the anti-trafficking task force. So as opposed to the task force just being police officers and police trained officers, we may need to include some NGO representation there. We also need to look at substance abuse, because that too is another causative factor that we must pay attention to and we must treat with. So we can't want to treat with violence against women and girls and we don't have sufficient services to treat with substance abuse. And we're closing down the little that we have. We have to have sufficient resources to treat with substance abuse. Many of these men or these perpetrators are substance abusers. And so that too must be looked into. But as I close, Madam Presiding Officer, I want to say to the Tobagonian that is looking that we are a small society. Tobago is an island of small villages. That's why we practically know somebody from almost every family on the island, every extended family on the island, because we are an island of small villages. It is very easy for the matter of gender-based violence to get out of hand. But it also should be easier than for most other societies for us to treat with it, because physically our numbers are smaller. And so we have to work post-haste on this matter. We have to. And for those who are community leaders, you have a role to play. The days when you turn a blind eye to teachers who sexually abuse girls must come to an end. You have a responsibility. If you know that your brethren and your partner on the block looking for some young school girl or climbing through some back door, some window when the night comes, you have a responsibility. Right down the block, you could stop your brethren from committing these acts. If you know that this woman, for all she years married to this man, keep eating licks left, right, and center, and all you do about it is sit down and laugh and comment and pick up the phone and WhatsApp and videotape it to send to another neighbor, then you are equally culpable. You have a responsibility too. We have to get this right. And women, you too have a responsibility, because most times when we discuss this issue, we discuss it from the perspective that men have all these responsibilities not to be violent towards women and girls. But as I explained, many women are active participants to violence against women and girls. They are active supporters. And you women, you have a responsibility to play as well. You have a responsibility to be honest as well. Because another factor affecting all of this is that we do have some cases where false claims are made against men. That just muddies the water for everybody and creates doubt whenever victims step forward. So women, you have a responsibility. Single mothers, I know your job is hard, but if you do nothing else, treat your sons to be different than their father who left you or who treated you poorly. Treat your son to be less toxic and to be respectful of women and girls. And if we all pitch in and all do our part, then we will not just have a committee that will investigate this matter and do a report, but we will be well on our way to remedying a very vexing issue as violence against women and girls. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer.
Assistant Secretary in the Division of Infrastructure, Quarries and the Environment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think this is one of the